Well, thank you, and I'm simply delighted to be invited by Bridwell Library to offer this library lecture. Bridwell, as you know, has a rich and distinctive collection of materials illustrative of print culture, and I'd have to say that a lot of what I know about printing and print media I learned while a graduate student, living and moving and having my being within these walls. Also serving as a pre-cataloger for some Bridwell materials and absorbing the culture of books and printing that one simply cannot fail to encounter in this place. We live today in an age of rapidly expanding media production, including the production of books. The R.R. Boker Company is the company that allocates International Standard Book Numbers, ISBNs, and they reported that in 2003, United States publishing companies produced a total of 215,777 new books by traditional publishing methods. By 2010, that number had grown to 316,480 new books, but these count only traditionally published works in English published in the United States. In 2010, the total number of ISBNs published in the United States included another 2.7 million non-traditional titles produced here, including self-published books, reprinted works that are in the public domain, and other print-on-demand books. To this you could add e-books, books published in other languages than English, and books published in other countries, whether in English or not. These figures have some startling implications for all who read books, and some implications for those of us who write books. A long, long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, a book contract from a publisher meant a commitment not only to print and bind the book, but a commitment to readers that the book had been judged worthy of publication by at least someone. And to writers of books, it meant a commitment to market the book as well. Book production was so expensive in those days that publishers simply could not afford to risk publishing a book that had little chance of selling 1,000 copies or more. But that was not really a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. It was about 30 years ago in the United States. It is now so inexpensive to produce printed books and e-books today that a commitment to publish by itself carries very little commitment to marketing the volume beyond keeping it in the publisher's list. A publisher can afford to keep a large list of volumes available and hit the button to print and bind a copy whenever a book is actually ordered. And actually, they don't even have to hit the button now. The order from Amazon.com automatically generates an instruction to have a copy of the book printed, bound, and shipped to the purchaser. And the same thing is true with the production of music by way of online services such as iTunes, and video productions by way of YouTube and Vimeo and other services. And it's just as easy to translate those online media into CDs or DVDs available for purchase and produced on demand just as books are now produced. The implication for writers and other producers of media is that a commitment to publish a work does not at all guarantee that it will actually be sold. The implication for readers and other consumers of media is that just because a work appears in a nice binding with an ISBN doesn't mean that anyone except the author has actually read the work or listened to it or viewed it and has judged it worthy of public consumption. The vast democratization of media means, on the one hand, that this is, by the way, my own book on my Campbell family ancestors, self-published, and I couldn't even get anybody, even in my own family, to read it before it was published. And this is my own video about the history of my neighborhood here in Dallas. And again, it's entirely self-produced, but you can go on Amazon and order lots of copies of these for your families and your BFFs and everybody that you know. The democratization of the media really means that a huge new variety of works are available to consumers, including independently produced or indie productions. It also means that traditional ways of evaluating and marketing works no longer apply, perhaps to the majority of titles and works actually being published today. There was, of course, a prehistory to this development, and I want to tell you that Methodists actually played a prominent role in the democratization of media that we have seen accelerating in recent years. For a decade or two after Johann Gutenberg produced his 42-line Bible in the 1450s, printing on movable type was the most rarefied of arts, an art that only a handful of specialists could possibly hope to practice. But by the end of the 15th century, within just a few decades, printing had become so much more widespread. I know this not only because we lived behind the Oxford University Press bookstore on the High Street, Oxford, when they were celebrating the 500th anniversary of the press in 1978 and 9, but also because I spent the spring and summer of 1984 pre-cataloging Savonarola Incunabula for Bridwell Library. Look it up on Google if you don't know what that is. And I came to realize that Savonarola was something like the Oral Roberts of the 15th century, keeping the presses in Florence in business, producing a voluminous literature in support of his reforming cause. So we're really just seeing today a kind of expansion of a process that began a long time ago. And what I want to tell you is that Methodists then had something to do with this. Harry S. Stout's 1991 biography of George Whitefield, entitled The Divine Dramatist, argued that Whitefield was not only a talented performer. It was said that he could put an audience in tears just by the way he pronounced the word Mesopotamia. See, I say it and they laugh, but he could get people to cry from doing that. He was a trained actor, and moreover, he was a successful self-marketer. To quote Stout, quote, "Mass media constitutes the means whereby Whitefield attracted and directed his mass religious following. Whitefield, in particular, learned to exploit the emerging world of print journalism to promote his tours." Although Stout argued that Whitefield was ahead of his peers in doing so, I would have to argue that Whitefield's acquaintance John Wesley also exploited the increasingly democratic medium of printed works, not only books and pamphlets, but by Wesley's published journal and his voluminous public correspondence in popular periodical literature of his age. One of John Wesley's earliest publishing enterprises came during the second year of his American journey in 1737. In that year, he contracted with a Charleston, South Carolina printer named Louis Timothy to print a small collection of psalms and hymns. I have a facsimile version of the 1737 collection of psalms and hymns here with me today. This illustrates the ease and speed with which publishing could be accomplished even in a colonial American setting. Wesley contacted Louis Timothy on Thursday, April 14, 1737, and by Monday evening, April 18, 4 days later, he was reviewing proof sheets that Timothy had produced. He then began using the collection in his Savannah congregation by the summer of that year. This set a precedent for John Wesley's subsequently published works. Wesley eventually published more than 500 titles in his lifetime, but he did not work with established publishers like the Oxford University Press. Rather, he contracted directly with independent printers and provided the printers with his manuscripts. The printer would produce proof sheets, which Wesley would then correct. Then the printer would print the book, often on paper that Wesley himself supplied. Here is an illustration of something from the display that we've got going right now, but these are the actual proof sheets that he got from his printer, and it actually shows you different places where he's marked corrections and actually additions in the proof sheets themselves. So I'm going to have to learn how to turn on this little light here. And there it is. We're all good. When books were bound, the binding was almost always done by a specialist in that art, someone different from the printer. But Wesley's publications were often small works like tracts or short collections of hymns or poems, and single issue fascicles of his published journal printed in one signature or gathering of pages that did not require binding. Here's another item that's on display right now in our display. This shows one of George Whitfield's works that was placed in a temporary wrapper, kind of like a brown paper bag wrapper, and sewn with a single thread, as you'll see in the exhibition if you go and look at it. Wesley's works were thus self-published, that is to say, he himself was responsible for the content of his works, and he did not rely on a traditional book publisher for financing, printing, or marketing his published works. Now, one of the issues was that printers actually expected to be paid, and most of them usually expected to be paid up front for their services. John Wesley insisted that he took no profits from his publishing enterprise, but rather plowed the money back into publishing and distribution. He occasionally had to borrow money from supporters in advance of sales of his publication so he could get the printer to print up copies of them. When he married Mary Vasile, née Goldhawk, in 1749, he began to utilize Mary, who had considerable business experience, as his agent in dealing with London printers. And although they had a prenuptial agreement according to which their finances would remain separate after their marriage, and I'm not making this up, they had prenups back then, this did not keep him from occasionally requesting to borrow money from Mary's accounts, as the following letter from January 1756 reveals. This is one of 137 letters from John Wesley that we have in the collection here at Bridwell. I'm editing John Wesley's letters. This is actually the very first one in my volume because it's January 1756 that it begins. And Bridwell has the third largest collection of Wesley manuscript letters in the world. This is one of them. He writes to her, "I desire you would give John Spencer," taking his receipt, "or Brother Atkinson, unless you choose to pay Mr. Davenport yourself, what note money remains in your hands. Unless you can help me out for a month or two, I must borrow some more in town. If you can, you will do it with pleasure." In fact, his correspondence with Mary often took the rather cold tone of dealing with one's business manager or publication agent, and I have wondered in another article if this, compared to the rather warm way in which he often wrote to younger married women, may have contributed to the dissolution of their relationship by the late 1750s. Even when they were reconciled for a few years in the 1770s, John Wesley continued to write to Mary in this way and again revealed his struggle to finance his publishing projects. Here's something he wrote to her in the 1770s. He wrote, "I am just now come hither from Glasgow and take this opportunity of writing 2 or 3 lines. I desire you would let Mr. Pine," that's one of his printers, "have £100 of that money which is in your hands, provided he gives you his full account first, which I must beg of you to send to London to John Atley, together with £50 for Mr. Nin, the papermaker, and £50 for Robert Hawes. There is no use in letting the money lie dead. If I do not administer, I can but pay this again. I am just going to preach, and I am in great haste." Okay, that's his letter. John Wesley used the Methodist preachers as his agents in disseminating his publications. Each local society was to have a small shelf or store of works available, and traveling preachers were encouraged to carry copies and make them available. Wesley came to rely on book stewards as his agents in marketing his books and could be very demanding about making sure that the books appeared wherever he was to preach. Here's an excerpt from a letter to Matthew Arrington, Errington, who served as his book steward in Newcastle. He writes, "Oh, Matthew, how is this? There is not one Milton here, nor one set of the philosophy. Pray send immediately 12 sets of the philosophy and 20 Miltons, if you have more than 20 at Newcastle, for you must not be left without some, and see that they are here before I return, which I expect will be on Saturday fortnight, so that on Tuesday fortnight, June 19th, you will, if God permits, see me at Newcastle. The Word of God has free course in North Britain, even among honorable and right honorable sinners," he writes. In fact, what he did was, on the back of the letter, as you can see here, he wrote out an even fuller list of the books that he wanted Arrington to send him. And here at a number of points, you can actually see Arrington's notations of the earnest appeal. He says, he has none of the plain account of Christian perfection. I have none of the primitive physic. Now, that's his very popular book of home remedies for medical cures. He doesn't have here he notes he's got 60 or 80, can't read it. And Answer to Bishop Warburton, he says he has 80 copies of those. So you can actually see how his book steward is kind of working through the stock that he's got on hand and making them available. One of the tensions that John Wesley faced in his leadership of the Methodist movement was between himself and other Methodist leaders who did not share his views of the Methodist revival and of the allegiance that he thought Methodists owed to the Church of England. In 1756, one of the Methodist preachers, Edward, he always called him Ned Perronet, published a work entitled The Mitre, which involved a sustained attack on the Church of England. And we have one copy of this available in the display over here. Charles Wesley wrote to John in November of that year, bitterly complaining about this book and urging John to rein in Perronet by simply casting him out of the Methodist societies, which John eventually did. John apparently agreed with Charles about this matter because he either suppressed the book, that's what our display says, or I have another note that says he actually tried to buy up all the copies he could find and then destroy them so that they wouldn't be disseminated. But despite John's attempt, he and Charles did not communicate with each other for 3.5 years after this point, which I think shows you how bitter it was between them. The incident shows, I think, what could become a major problem when preachers followed Wesley's example of self-publishing rather than simply distributing the books that John Wesley had made available to them. So now I want to cross the Atlantic and talk about Methodist book publication in America. American Methodists became involved in the publishing business within a few months of the first Methodist missionaries being sent to North America by the British Methodist Conference in 1769. But the very first Methodist publications in America were themselves a bit of an indie production. In December of that year, 1769, Methodist preacher by the name of Robert Williams had Charles Wesley's Hymns for the Nativity of Our Lord, this is a collection of Christmas hymns, printed for the use of his congregations. He followed this in 1770 with reprints of John Wesley's sermons and eventually other works. Williams was accused of personally profiting from his reprints rather than following the precedent that profits from publishing should fund Methodist missions and other publications. As a result, the 1773 American Conference of Methodist Preachers forbade unauthorized publications of the Wesley's works, and the printing and distribution of Wesley's works was then undertaken by Thomas Rankin, whom my students in the United Methodist History course will recognize as Wesley's preferred and trusted superintendent for America. But Rankin and most of the preachers who had come from England left America within a couple of years in the heat of the American Revolution, leaving only Francis Asbury and a few untrained native-born lay preachers to carry on the life of the American Methodist societies. After the establishment of the Methodist Episcopal Church in 1784, the new denomination established a book publishing outfit that they called the Book Concern. That's the joke available in the title of my lecture, A Concern for Books. The first Methodist publishing house was called the Book Concern of the Methodist Episcopal Church. They did this in 1789, and in fact, one of the things we have on display is that they named a man named John Dickens as the first general book steward of the Book Concern of the Methodist Episcopal Church. Here you've got, at the back of one of his publications, a listing of all the publications that were available at that point, probably 1790 or 1791. Based in Philadelphia, Dickens developed a book list including a number of items that had been published prior to the establishment of the Book Concern in 1789. For example, the minutes of the 1784 Christmas Conference, published previously under the title of Minutes of Several Recent Conversations, was republished with the title A Form of Discipline for the Ministers, Preachers, and Members of the Methodist Episcopal Church. That's basically what gave us the word discipline. That's kind of one of those sacred words or sacred cows among Methodist people today. Prominent among early publications of the Book Concern were spiritual autobiographies, a genre inspired by John Wesley's published journal. In its first years, the Book Concern published the Journal of Francis Asbury and the Experience and Travels of Mr. Freeborn Garretson, published from 1791. Here's a copy that we have actually on our display with the signature of the woman who owned this copy of it. From 1793, the publication list included the Journal of British Methodist preacher John Nelson and an omnibus collection of British Methodist spiritual autobiographies entitled The Experience of Several Eminent Methodist Preachers with an Account of Their Call to and Success in the Ministry. From 1804, the Book Concern offered the Memoirs of the Reverend Purdy Dickinson, an autobiographical account of another preacher associated with John Wesley. These works of autobiography were an important means of transmitting Methodist culture, since Methodist spirituality and theology had focused on what John Wesley called the way of salvation, the progress of the soul from conviction of sin to conversion and assurance through the progress and the process of sanctification. These autobiographical works illustrated the way of salvation in practical and sometimes exciting ways. Sometimes. Early general conferences of the Methodist Episcopal Church were concerned to regulate the denomination's publishing enterprise. The 1796 General Conference specifically instructed that, quote, "The general book steward shall print no books or tracts of any kind without the consent of a bishop and 2/3 of the Philadelphia Conference." That provided a level of accountability, but also allowed Dickinson to operate locally in the Philadelphia area. The 1808 General Conference added a further restriction, quote, "that no traveling preacher be permitted to publish any book or pamphlet without the approbation of the annual conference to which he belongs or a committee chosen by them." The understanding conveyed in this resolution was that Methodist clergy were not to be engaging in publications on their own apart from the consent of their conferences. And as we shall see, though, many preachers and clergy would test the limits of this restriction. And despite these restrictions, some versions of the denomination's discipline were independently printed in southern states, mysteriously or miraculously omitting the items specifically forbidding Methodists to practice the slave trade in the general rules, the most basic contract of Methodist morality. The 1808 General Conference also developed a constitution for the Methodist Episcopal Church, specifying 6 restrictive rules that prohibited the General Conference from altering fundamental elements of Methodist teaching and practice. It's interesting to note that among these 6 fundamental items is this: The General Conference shall not appropriate the produce of the book concern or of the charter fund to any other purpose than for the benefit of traveling, superannuated, supernumerary, and worn-out preachers, their wives, widows, and children. One could question whether such a rule reflects a truly fundamental element of Methodist polity alongside the doctrines taught in the Articles of Religion and the practices specified in the general rules. But a version of this rule remains in the discipline of the United Methodist Church today, protecting the principle that the proceeds of the publishing house go to the support of Methodist clergy and their families. If you've ever been to an annual conference, you may know one of the little rituals is typically the manager of the local Cokesbury store comes up and gives the bishop a check representing the proceeds of the publishing house for that year, and that goes to the ministerial fund of the United Methodist Church. 19th century publications did not typically identify the book concern of the Methodist Episcopal Church as the publisher of their books. They most consistently identified the publisher simply by the surnames of book agents in what seems to me to be a very cryptic way. For example, Lane and Scott, who served as book agents between 1848 and 1852, or Carleton and Porter, who served as book agents between 1856 and 1868. They also tend to give the address of the publishing house, for instance, 200 Mulberry Street in New York. In many cases, only an insider could know what was in fact an official Methodist publication. This leads me to suspect that Methodist publishers were not eager to brand their books as distinctly Methodist in hopes of selling a few books to persons of other denominations like Presbyterians and Baptists. Maybe this is like those contemporary Southern Baptist congregations today that simply identify themselves as something like Fellowship Church, but without revealing that they're Southern Baptist congregations. Here's an instance I'm showing you, and this is a book that my wife's sister actually gave me. This is the 1849 Methodist Episcopal Church Hymnal, and what you see is that on the reverse of the title page it says, entered according to an act of Congress in the year 1849 by Lane and Scott. Lane and Scott were the publishers of the Methodist Episcopal Church at that time. But then on the cover, the title page, it says, New York, published by Carleton and Porter, 200 Mulberry Street. And Carleton and Porter were the publishers later on. So I take it to mean it was registered in one year, but this is actually a reprint that occurred several years later when different publishing agents were being used by the Methodist book concern. One clear fact gives evidence of the book concern's intent to make its publications as widely as available as possible, and that is the fact that in the early 1800s they produced very small books whose physical size minimized production expenses. In introducing the best-selling pocket hymn book, for example, the editors noted, quote, the large congregational hymn book, that's the Wesley 1780 book of collection of hymns for the use of the people called Methodists, is admirable indeed, but it is too expensive for the poor who have little time and less money. So this item, and you can see it in my hands right here, if you can see up here, but there's a picture of it showing inches. Here I get a better image, but that's the actual book right there. You can see how tiny that is. And honestly, I can't see how anybody could read it without spectacles, that is to say, without glasses. But as Eric and I have talked about, the paper was the most expensive item in making a book available. So by publishing these tiny little books, they made them portable. That's one thing, so you could carry them. Most churches did not provide hymnals. You just brought your own hymnal to church every Sunday or whenever you had a meeting, and to make it portable was one thing, but I think cutting down costs was another item there. In the division of the Methodist Episcopal Church South in 1844, one of the most hotly contested issues between the northern and southern branches of American Methodism was the ownership of the denominational publishing house or book concern. This went all the way to the United States Supreme Court's decision by the United States Supreme Court in 1851, 52, and 54 mandated the Methodist Episcopal Church to divide the assets of its New York book concern, with half of the assets going to the Southern Church. This division of assets led to the establishment of a Southern Methodist publishing house in Nashville that began operations in 1856. Needless to say, though, Southern and Northern branches of Methodist publishing houses did not agree on which books they should publish. The Northern Methodist, the Methodist Episcopal Church, published Peter Cartwright's autobiography in 1856, a book that followed the typical pattern of earlier Methodist autobiographies, but also recounted in detail Cartwright's virulent hatred of slavery and his abolitionist activities. Needless to say, the publishing house of the Methodist Episcopal Church South refused to print the volume. But although they may have disagreed about Peter Cartwright, and however they have masked their denominational identities under the names of their book agents, the publishing houses of both the Northern and Southern Methodist churches published the official literature of their denominations, the hymnals, the books of discipline, and so forth, and the spiritual autobiographies of important Methodist leaders. But as Methodist historians have sought in recent decades to paint a broader and more inclusive picture of the American Methodist movement, we have become aware of a number of self-published works, especially by African American and Native American Methodists in the 19th century. The first of these came from the Reverend Richard Allen, who would eventually be elected in 1814 as the first bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Beginning his publishing career very much as John Wesley did, Allen had printed in 1801 a collection of hymns and spiritual songs from various authors for the use of his Philadelphia congregation, the congregation that would eventually come to be known as the Mother Bethel AME Church in that city. 19 years after his election to the episcopacy, in the year 1833, Allen turned to the genre of spiritual autobiography with the publication of The Life, Experience, and Gospel Labors of the Right Reverend Richard Allen. You'll notice the title there, he uses the expression Right Reverend. There had been a close connection between Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, who became eventually the first African-American priest ordained in the Episcopal Church, and they kind of parted ways and it got a little bitter. But one of the interesting things is that the AME Church has always taken up some of the nomenclature of the Episcopal Church, calling bishops Right Reverend and calling them prelates, for example, something that other Methodist churches in the United States did not actually take up. So this is published in 1833. It included his account of the founding of the AME Church and became really the foundational narrative of that denomination. I note that both of Allen's publications were well-produced volumes, and although the Life, Experience, and Gospel Labors noted that the work was written by himself and published at his request, as you may be able to see on the title page, the names of his printers for both volumes in Philadelphia and their addresses were prominently displayed on the title pages of the works. A similar narrative that appeared only 3 years after the initial publication of Allen's Life, Experience, and Gospel Labors was by one of Allen's converts and constituents, a woman named Jarena Lee, who wrote The Religious Experience and Journal of Mrs. Jarena Lee, giving an account of her call to preach the gospel, published originally in 1836. Jarena Lee linked her own narrative to that of Richard Allen by explaining that her conversion occurred under the influence of his preaching. As the title of her work notes, her autobiography not only narrates her experiences of conviction, conversion, and entire sanctification, but also her sense of a calling to preach. Her narrative thus served to justify her call to preach within the context of the emerging AME Church. And I note that the newly appointed AME bishop here in the Dallas area, Bishop Vashti McKenzie, is in fact the first woman to be elected as a bishop of that denomination, and she may then owe a certain debt of gratitude to the gospel labors of Jarena Lee, who sort of went before her and made the case for women preaching in that denomination. A similar narrative was composed by a Native American Methodist from New England and New York, a guy named William Appice, though the name is not spelled with two S's on the end in this publication. It was entitled A Son of the Forest, the experience of William, note the word experience in the title of all of these books. The experience of William Appice, a native of the forest, comprising a notice of the Pequod tribe of Indians, this book being published in 1829. Appice was a Native American, originally a member of the Methodist Episcopal Church, but when the Methodist Protestant denomination was organized in 1830, a year after the publication of A Son of the Forest, he elected to go with the newer and more democratic denomination. The book contains a lengthy appendix giving details about the history and cultures of Native American tribes, suggesting the similarity between many of their customs and those of Jews recorded in the Hebrew Scriptures. I note that it was published in New York State in 1829, the very year in which a man named Joseph Smith Jr. was engaged in translating the golden tablets he claimed to have found hidden in the wilderness of that state. The production of this book reveals something of its character. The paper seems to be severely yellowed, suggesting that it was cheaper pulp paper made of wood pulp, and it is cut to an odd, non-standard size. No printer is identified for the book. The work could not have been proofread. The title page for the appendix was printed upside down. This suggests a work that was not only self-published, but published perhaps hastily and as inexpensively as possible, and one with which a printer did not care to be identified. A subsequent reprinting of the book in 1831 corrected some of these errors. Yet another self-published spiritual narrative came from a woman named Zilpha Elaw. Memoirs of the Life, Religious Experience, Ministerial Travels, and Labors of Mrs. Zilpha Elaw, an American female of color, together with some accounts of the great religious revivals in America. Published in Britain in 1846. This work was published in Britain, and unlike the works by Jarena Lee and William Appice, it lists the names and addresses of its printers. Maybe that's a British pub printing custom as opposed to American ones. One of the small ironies of this work is that the printer listed was on Charterhouse Lane in London, the exact location of the Charterhouse School that John Wesley had attended in his youth. The title of the work reflects that of Richard Allen's narrative, though Zilpha Elaw was a member of the Methodist Episcopal Church, and she was a very brave one at that. Not only did she preach itinerantly without church authorization, she even traveled into slave-holding states such as Maryland and preached there, where she, as a free black woman, was subject to being captured and sold into slavery. Again, her narrative served to justify her call to preach. Similar to these narratives is that of Julia A.J. Foote, A Brand Plucked from the Fire, an autobiographical sketch, published in 1879. Julia Foote was a member of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, and she was attracted to the nascent holiness movement that was influencing American Methodist churches in the late 1800s. Those familiar with Methodist culture will recognize her title, A Brand Plucked from the Fire, as reflecting a cardinal incident in the early life of John Wesley, as well as Zechariah 3, verse 2. In the year 1900, Julia Foote was ordained as the first woman elder in the AME Zion Church, and she died later in that same year. All of these self-published works, with the exception of Richard Allen's 1801 collection of hymns, were cast in the mold of the Methodist genre of the spiritual narrative illustrating the way of salvation, and they serve to justify to a reading public the ministries of an African American man, 3 African American women, and a Native American Methodist preacher. I do not at all doubt that Euro-American men in the Methodist Episcopal Church were producing similar self-published spiritual narratives. But in the cases of these 5 individuals, self-publishing was a means by which they could justify themselves and their ministries to a broader public. If someone wants to bring up the house lights now. I'm coming toward the end, and go ahead there. Yeah, hit that. It's going to take a couple of minutes for those to come up. Like John Wesley, each of these persons buttressed their own preaching ministries by disseminating printed materials further, explaining their distinctive perspectives and their claims to authentic Christian ministries. Methodists then played a role in the democratization of print media in the 18th and 19th centuries. From the time of John Wesley, they were users of printing technologies available in their time, and they were producers of content that was disseminated by way of print media. The Methodists' appeal to working-class people in this age and their Arminian theology suggesting the openness of the gospel to all people created a culture in which democratization was a kind of given, and yet the challenge of democratic governance created one of the most consistent tensions and one of the most consistent sources of division in Methodist groups in the late 18th century and the early 19th century. And the Methodists obviously weren't the only ones utilizing new print media. George Whitefield and other Calvinistic evangelical preachers, often described as Methodists in a broad sense of the word, were utilizing the same print media to disseminate their ideas. As were religious and poetic radicals like the visionaries Richard Brothers and Joanna Southcott and the poet William Blake. Political revolutionaries in France and America in the same period, like Tom Paine, were harnessing the power of print media to get their messages out. Conservatives, horrified at the French and American revolutions, like Edmund Burke and Hannah More, utilized print media to warn of the dangers of revolutionary ideas and to suggest the virtue of remaining in one's appointed station in life. So perhaps in the future, when students are looking at their little foldable film screens or whatever they have and read on brilliant HD displays you can just pull out of your pocket, the story of the democratization of media in the modern world, perhaps they'll learn a little bit about the fact that John Wesley and the people called Methodists played a role in that democratization and that development. I want to encourage you not only to take advantage of the refreshments that are going to be available. You've suffered through this and paid your price for them, after all. Bridwell is providing them, but I want you to also go across the way and peruse the current exhibit on early Methodists and their books. In the Elizabeth Perkins Prothero Gallery. You will see actual copies of many of the items I've been talking about today. And again, my thanks to Bridwell Library for the opportunity to offer this lecture, and thank you all for coming and being here. Thank you.